Hello, AP kids. Kind of sitting out here on the front porch and thinking we should talk about the DBQ. In fact, we're going to practice one today. We're going to go through one just to help you get ready. So here we go. And this one's about Queen Elizabeth. Here we go. So here's the question. Analyze the influence of ideas about gender on the reign of Elizabeth I and explain how Elizabeth responded to these ideas. Sometimes the AP exam will give you some background information here, and it reminds you a little bit about who Elizabeth was, daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, and followed the reigns of her half-brother, Edward, and half-sister Mary, otherwise known as Bloody Mary. So that's what you have. Anything else you bring out about Elizabeth is outside information. So remember, we want to analyze the documents. We want to connect them to the question. We want some outside information in the intro. We want some outside information in the text. We want to do some sourcing or point of view as we analyze. And if we can, we want to extend the question at the end. That's our basic plan for all DBQs. Let's take a look at the 5 documents. And you're going to read through the documents when you start your DBQ. So here we go. This one's John Knox, Scottish religious reformer, from first blast of the trumpet against the monstrous rule or regiment of women, 1558. So right away, this should remind us of some of the context. Maybe we might put this in the introduction. Maybe it would work for this document, but Elizabeth is Queen of England during the Reformation. So gender is not the only issue she's got to grapple with, but she's got to grapple with the tensions between Catholics, Protestants, and then within Protestants, Anglican, Calvinist. And so you might remember that John Knox is a Calvinist in Scotland who wrote this against 3 women. This would be some good outside information to give context to this particular document, that he wrote it against 3 queens, Catherine de' Medici, Mary, Queen of Scots, and Elizabeth. And part of his reasons might have been he didn't like women, but part of them also had to do with the fact that none of them liked his religion. Catherine and Mary are Catholics, and Elizabeth was no fan of Calvinists. Sourcing point of view, right? So he's a man, but that's a little obvious. It might be something you want to talk about. You might be get more benefit by talking about the fact that he is a Calvinist and a Scotsman who's not going to like an English queen who is against Calvinists. She called them barking dogs. Okay. And so then we read the document, and he's using a religious argument which connects to his cultural attitude about women in general to attack Elizabeth. But remember, that's not the only issue. If you just say, oh, he just doesn't like women, he doesn't like women queens, and there's religion tied up. So you want to be a little sophisticated in there. But certainly there are these cultural attitudes that that many men would have had against a woman. Now, let me back up for a minute. Dates are sort of important to notice, not to remember, but to notice. So if you back up, Elizabeth becomes queen in 1558. Notice the year this is published. So she's 25 years old. She's a brand new queen. She has not yet established her power. We'll look at some other documents in a minute. We'll notice the dates there. Generally, the AP exam will give you the documents in chronological order. Change over time is actually one of their themes. So here's a second document. Again, a man, Nicholas Heath, Archbishop of York, which is a religious person, religious leader, actually one of the top 2 religious leaders. And he's debating before the House of Lords, 1558. Elizabeth has just come to the throne. Remember, Elizabeth is illegitimate. Her predecessor is Catholic Mary. Nicholas, if he is the Archbishop, would have been put there by Mary. He's not going to be a fan of Elizabeth as a Protestant. And of course, again, gender may be one of the arguments he uses to also undermine her authority. Now, in this one, he is saying that Elizabeth cannot be the head of the church. So she's going to be queen, she can't be head of the church. Well, that's a problem because in England, after Henry VIII, the monarch is the head of the church. Now, Mary, as a Catholic, had pushed more for the Pope to be head of the church. That never really worked out. Now here's Elizabeth as a Protestant who is likely to take the role of head of the church. Nicholas doesn't like that for religious reasons and gender reasons. And so, again, Heath is probably a former friend of Mary's, or else he wouldn't be in this position. Now, what if you don't know that? Well, remember, you've got to source 2 of these for the 5-document DBQ. 3 is preferable. If you can't come up with point of view or sourcing, move on. So we see an analysis that Heath may not be opposing Elizabeth as queen, but he doesn't want her head of the church. Maybe he's saying, look, if we're going to have a queen, fine, but she can't be head of the church. Hey, let's call the Pope up, or some male council, perhaps. So we're not quite sure if he's opposing Elizabeth altogether or just as head of the church, but he definitely doesn't like that. If she's going to be queen, he wants to reduce her power over the church. And he is an archbishop, which, by the way, would make him one of the heads of the church. So the next one is a friend of Elizabeth's tutor. We don't know if he's a friend of Elizabeth or pro-Elizabeth. And in fact, this document's interesting. The first 2, because one thing we want to do is categorize. The first 2 are definitely women are not qualified to be rulers, or if they happen to end up a queen, it's sort of second best. We're not really big on women ruling. Now, this one's interesting because it seems to say, don't worry, it's okay if Elizabeth is queen because, hey, we've got some guys to keep an eye on her. It's an interesting one. He's a tutor, friend of Elizabeth. You might think he might lean Elizabeth, and maybe he did, but this is where you want to read this carefully. The regiment of England, or the rule of England, is not a mere monarchy. Okay, in other words, it's not just about the queen. To be sure, if Elizabeth were a mere monarch and not a mixed ruler, and they let you know, that means a ruler who shares power with Parliament, right? So that's fairly unique to England at this time. You might, peradventure, make me fear the matter more, and less to defend the cause. But in England, it's not so dangerous a matter to have a woman ruler. So he's like, yeah, if the queen here actually ran things, it'd be a little worrisome to have a woman there, but don't worry, there's a lot of guys. In fact, Parliament's all men, and so don't worry, they will restrain her from doing any stupid woman stuff, is kind of the tone here. So he's defending her, but it's a backhanded defense. So this is an interesting one. It could go in either category. And then again, is he, you notice this is a pamphlet, so maybe he really likes Elizabeth, but he can't just come out and say he likes Elizabeth because he's a man, she's a woman. So maybe he's trying to sort of soften the criticism. We don't know. If he's serious, he's backhanded complimenting her. If he's playing a rhetorical game here to kind of chill people out because he really does like Elizabeth, it's hard to tell from this. Don't read something into it that's not there. However, you could mention both of those. You could say either he likes Elizabeth and he's just playing to a male audience, or he really believes that as a woman, she's not that great a choice, but it's okay because there's a parliament of men to watch her. It's an interesting question. It's a tricky little document. And I think it's kind of interesting because of that. Look for those subtleties. So in the analysis, basically, we have a male parliament. So if she does something silly, there's male oversight. So it's all going to be okay. So he's in favor, yet he's condescending. Okay, but in the sourcing, you can see there I wrote out, it kind of depends on whether he's playing a game here or whether you're just hearing his straight thoughts. Okay, that's an interesting document. All right, now, next, the French ambassador. By the way, you can see why there's not any women in here yet. So just saying, oh, because he's a man, yeah, not so great. And this is interesting because as the French ambassador, you're not sure how he feels about Elizabeth. Maybe he's a little more objective because he's outside the situation. By the way, the year is now 1566, so she's had a few years under her belt. And he seems to be telling a story. What they asked was nothing less than wishing her to dig her grave before she was dead. And from the introduction, you can see that they is Parliament. Addressing herself to the Lord, she said, so now you're going to hear Elizabeth's voice through this guy. So this, again, a little tricky. Are we hearing his voice or are we hearing her voice? We're hearing both. My lords, do what you will. As for myself, I shall do nothing according to my pleasure, and so on. So you can read that. So remember, early on, there's a lot of pressure on Elizabeth to get married and have kids because having an heir is important. And if you read on, she is really pushing back against people pressuring her. In fact, I love this line in here. You can sense her sarcasm. This is really a document within a document. She says, besides which you desire an affair of much harebrains. Can you imagine the President of the United States addressing Congress as a, oh yeah, I guess you don't have to imagine that. You can imagine far worse. Okay, so anyway, she basically tells off Parliament, you know, you men, you not of harebrains. So clearly, in one sense, you hear that the confidence of Elizabeth. Now, is the French ambassador objective? Well, this is a report to his king. He's reporting back home. So he has no reason not to be objective in just giving the straight story to the king. He doesn't have any skin in this game because he's not English. He's just getting the facts, the intelligence back to the French government, which possibly makes him a fairly objective observer. And maybe we are truly hearing her voice. Certainly, he doesn't spare the details here. Okay, so that might be a good point of view. La Forest is objective. And then the analysis might be to talk about the tone of Elizabeth, right? So you can see again, this one's a more subtle document. In last document 5, we now hear Elizabeth's voice, and this is published after she died, but it's supposedly a speech she gave early in her reign. And here we can bring in the outside information of Elizabeth crafting her image, the so-called Virgin Queen, because in this she says, I have already joined myself in marriage to a husband, namely the Kingdom of England. Okay, so we see her early on saying, I'm married to England and I'm not going to be tied, I don't need a man. And then she says, and behold, which I marvel you have forgotten, the pledge of this my wedlock and marriage with my kingdom. It says, and therewith she drew her ring from her finger and showed it. So again, two voices here, Elizabeth's, but also who's writing the official history, we don't know. It seems to be a fairly objective account. You know, it's her words and her actions. And again, we hear this rebuke, and you could connect that then to the fact that Elizabeth was very crafty at PR, had paintings of herself given all over England and went on tours. That would be great outside info. And that her nickname, the Virgin Queen, is in Virginia, one of our states. It was part of her PR image to say, I'm married to England. It made her very popular with the people. Again, this idea that she has to be married, right? Because we want to always connect this back to gender. That's the question. So now we've analyzed the documents. Now we need to sketch out an outline and write this essay. And don't worry, we're not going to write the whole essay here in this video. But notice there's really two key parts to the question. One, the influence of ideas about gender. Secondly, how does Elizabeth respond? Okay. And so the context, I want to put this in the introduction. It's an age of turmoil, religious controversy. I might talk about her illegitimate status. I mean, there's lots of things we could put in here. And then ultimately she became a great ruler. And then thesis, although young Queen Elizabeth faced opposition due to being female and the controversial idea of a woman as head of the church. Here's the first part, gender. She overcame male opposition through careful cultivation of her image and force of will. I think we can get that out of the documents we read where she is talking about her image as the Virgin Queen, about her calling them a knot of harebrains, about the tone of her in those two documents she's quoting. So can I use the 5 documents to prove this case? Yes. Yes, I can. I can talk about gender attitudes from the first couple. I can talk about her response from the last couple. So we can work that in. So now what's that going to look like? So again, now I'm going to, here's the context. We already did this in the previous slide. Here's the thesis. We already did that. So if I want to write a 4-paragraph essay, which is fine, I might take documents 1 and 2. So think about groups. How can I group the documents? Well, here are the opponents. I could take a little time at that third one from the tutor and talk about how for Elizabeth and yet kind of condescending, but perhaps he was playing a rhetorical game. And these would be fairly short paragraphs, but it's a 45-minute writing time. So short and quick, 5 documents. We're condensing everything we've learned here. And then 4 and 5, oops, that's supposed to be a 4. There's a 4. Number 4 and 5, this is her response, right? This is the second part of the thesis, her force of will. And so now I've answered, right? So the first part is answered here in 1, and to some extent in 2, and then the second part is answered in paragraph 3. Okay, could I combine these two? Sure, I could. I could write a 3-paragraph essay That's going to be fine in a 45-minute, very short time period that you have. If I want to extend, get that 6 point, as we like to call it, I can compare her perhaps to Victoria and Elizabeth, saying England has had great queens and she was one of them. Or I could compare her to other queens of the time period, more or less, like Catherine the Great or Maria Theresa. I could go either way with that, right? But that would be a very simple way to connect, extending the question beyond Elizabeth to other women who overcame problems that were seen with their gender, by their culture, and overcame that to be great queens and so on. Okay, so that's a pretty easy extension. That's an easy point you can pick up. Okay, and if I have time, I tack that on a conclusion. If I don't, I've got a 5 out of 6. So there we go. There's the plan. And I want to do one more thing with this then. First of all, we break down where the points are. We see we have the point for outside contact. We have the point for the thesis that fully responds to the question. That's why it's so important to analyze that question. We tackle all the documents. Be sure and tackle all the documents. There's only 5. You got to tackle them all. Don't leave one out. And then a point for extending beyond the question. Okay, we like these points. So we're racking up a lot of points here. Let's finish by doing a sample paragraph. So if I back up, I'm going to do documents 1 and 2. This is the second paragraph, or body paragraph 1, however you want to think about it. So first I want outside info, and I could really do that with both of these, right? I could talk about, a lot about John Knox being a Scottish Calvinist. Okay, so I can this is outside info. This, knowing a bit about the Reformation, knowing that he had opposed, that these two were targets of the trumpet blast, that's great outside info. Boom, I've got the point. I don't have to do anything else. But why not throw a couple extras in just in case you mess up? It might be a stretch to guess that he owed his position to Mary, but if he is the Archbishop when Elizabeth is first on the throne, it makes sense. Okay, but definitely the John Knox stuff, that would be outside info. Remember, you only need to do that one time in the introduction and one other time in the entire rest of the essay. So if I couldn't do it in this paragraph, I could possibly do it later on with some of the other documents. Now I want to talk about point of view. Okay, what can I do with point of view? So I'm going to talk about, why not mention the man part? I mean, we can certainly use that, but I want to do more than that. And notice I said he fought other queens. And then here, perhaps this archbishop is afraid of a woman being his boss. Notice how I've connected gender to point of view. And I've gone a little bit beyond by just saying, yeah, these guys are guys. We've kind of gone a little deeper. So, stop and think about the documents. Look at the description of the author. That's the critical piece of point of view. Why would this person say what they're saying? Now you can talk about the tone of the document. So like we could talk about the harshness of Elizabeth's tone to Parliament. We could talk about the audience being Parliament, which and then some of the other documents. So there's a lot of ways we can do what they're more and more calling sourcing. But point of view, really, who wrote this? Why would they say it? That's still the easiest way, I think, to think about this. Okay, and so we want to talk about motive, right? What we used to call bias, but point of view is a much better way to say that. And last, we want to bring in analysis. We want to make sure we're doing some good analysis here. And so in both of these, they're connecting theology to the role of a woman as head of the church. And that's why they belong in the same paragraph. That's what Knox says. He calls it usurping authority, quoting scripture, perhaps misquoting scripture, but that's his business. But the point is, he's trying to bring in the authority of religion, connecting with the fact that she's a woman to win his argument. And see, here we go. Also, Archbishop Heath does the same thing. Here's my analysis. So now I have done outside info, I've done analysis, and I've done sourcing. This is all for document 1. By the way, notice that I mentioned document 1 just to make sure that the reader has a little bit of extra guidance here plowing through this. Doesn't matter if you do that technically, but I will tell you as a former reader, it's helpful. And then here we have Heath. Why do they belong in the same paragraph? 2 religious guys using religion to go against the queen. They fear her authority, and they bring the fact she's a woman into it. All right, I hope that was helpful. as a little run through. You have some practice ones, work on those, get those back to me, and we will Zoom about these here shortly as well. Take care.